Over 100 years ago, in 1908, in the south of Italy, a complete disaster occurred, resulting in the deaths of over 100,000 people and the suffering of countless others. Stay tuned while we rewind the events of the most devastating recorded earthquake and tsunami to ever hit Europe. It was a winter morning at the end of December. The residents of Messina, a port city located in the northeast corner of Sicily in the Strait of Messina, were suddenly awakened at 5:20 a.m., when most of them were still in their beds, by violent earth shaking that lasted for more than 30 seconds, with a moment magnitude of 7.1 and a maximum Mercalli intensity of 11. The earthquake almost leveled the city of Messina, with up to 91% of structures destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Many survivors fled to the relative safety of the seafront to escape their collapsing houses. 10 minutes after the earthquake, the seafront along with the port of Messina were flooded by a tsunami who claimed the life of many earthquake survivors. This double catastrophe took the lives of more than half of Messina's 160,000 inhabitants. Let's rewind even further and talk about the conditions for a disaster of this scale to occur. To better understand what has happened, we need to first take a look at the region's geography. Italy sits along the boundary zone of the African continental plate, and this plate is pushing against the sea floor underneath Europe at a rate of 25 millimeters per year. This causes vertical displacement, which can cause earthquakes. Sicily and Calabria are known as La Terra Ballerina, the dancing land, for the periodic seismic activity that strikes the region. The earthquake epicenter was in the Strait of Messina, which separates Sicily from the Italian mainland and is part of the regional tectonic feature known as the Calabrian Arc. Records indicate that considerable seismic activity occurred in the areas around the Strait of Messina several months prior to December 28. It increased in intensity beginning on November 1. On December 10, a magnitude 4 earthquake caused damage to a few buildings in Novara di Sicilia in the province of Messina. But on the morning of Monday, December 28, 1908, the inevitable happened. At 5:20 and 27 seconds a.m., a 7.1 magnitude earthquake struck, inflicting heavy damage on Messina structures, many of them collapsing and killing their inhabitants, with a death toll of almost 75,000. More than half of the city's population. Reggio Calabria, the port city on the other shore of the Strait of Messina, and other locations in Calabria also suffered heavy damage, with the destruction felt over a 4,300 square kilometers area and an estimate of 25,000 people killed. The number of casualties is based on the 1901 and 1911 census data. Damage was also inflicted along the eastern Sicilian coast, but outside of Messina, it was not as badly hit as Calabria. A young doctor who escaped with his life described the events as follows.
The profound silence was broken by an extraordinary noise, like the bursting of 1,000 bombs, followed by a rushing and torrential rain.
Then he heard a sinister whistling sound, which he described as
1,000 red-hot irons hissing in the water.
Other survivors reported that there were 3 separate and different movements during the 37-second May shock, the first shaking backwards and forwards, the second thrusting violently upwards, and the third moving in a circular motion. Most accounts concur that it was the second upward motion that caused the widespread destruction in Messina. The accompanying noise was described as having been exactly like that made by a fast train in a tunnel. About 10 minutes after the earthquake, the sea on both sides of the strait suddenly withdrew as a 12-meter tsunami swept in, and 3 waves struck nearby coasts. It impacted the hardest along the Calabrian coast and inundated Reggio Calabria after the sea had receded 70 meters from the shore. The entire Reggio seafront was destroyed, and people who had gathered there perished. Along the coast, houses and a railway bridge were washed away. In Messina, the tsunami also caused more devastation and deaths. Many of the survivors of the earthquake fled to the relative safety of the seafront to escape their collapsing houses. The second and third tsunami waves, coming in rapid succession and higher than the first, raced over the harbor, smashed boats docked at the pier, and broke parts of the seawall. After engulfing the port and 3 city streets inland beyond the harbor, the waves swept away people, ships that had been anchored in the harbor, fishing boats and ferries, and inflicted further damage on the edifices within the zone that had remained standing after the shock. About 2,000 people were killed by the tsunami in Messina and on the eastern coast of Sicily, in Reggio Calabria and in its coastal surroundings. Those who survived the earthquake and the tsunami faced the bleakest of realities. Their homes were destroyed, their family members were dead, and the surrounding city was reduced to rubble. While the earthquake and tsunami were the main causes of destruction and deaths, the nightmare for the few lucky survivors was not over yet. A torrential downpour of rain that had begun only minutes before the earthquake added to the confusion, impeding visibility along with the darkness and thick clouds of dust from the rubble. The great gas tanks at the northern end of the city blew up, entombing living survivors and the already dead. Fires broke out, caused by broken gas pipes, which added to the chaos and destruction. The ground continued to shake with repeated aftershocks, causing remaining structures to topple down onto the ruins of collapsed buildings, killing and injuring rescuers and those who had survived the main shock. The increased death toll was due to the fact that most people were asleep and were killed instantly or buried alive in their beds as their houses collapsed on top of them. Thousands were trapped under rubbles, suffering horrific injuries. Survivors described seeing horribly disfigured bodies and badly wounded people who were screaming for help all over the city. Some recall that naked survivors carrying pictures of saints prayed in the streets. People searched with their bare hands through the debris for trapped loved ones amidst the fires and the surrounding buildings still collapsing. It must have felt like the end of the world for the few survivors who witnessed this apocalyptic scenery. Similar scenes of destruction were replicated in Reggio Calabria. Its historical center was eradicated, and the monumental Aragonese castle, one of the few edifices to have survived the 1783 earthquake, was badly damaged. The civilian and military hospitals in Messina and the civic hospital in Reggio Calabria all lay in ruins, with nearly all the doctors and nurses dead. The injured in the 2 cities had no medical support or medicine until outside relief arrived and hospital tents were set up. Telegraph lines were cut and railway lines mangled, making communication impossible. Most of Messina's officials were killed or gravely injured, along with almost the entire police force and soldiers of the garrison who perished when their respective barracks collapsed. Prisoners who had escaped death when the prison fell began looting property, and even robbing corpses of their jewelry. In Reggio, an estimated 1,800 convicts died when the prison was destroyed. Peasants from nearby rural villages joined the looters, since law enforcement was practically non-existent. The chief of police Paolo Caruso died in his office, killed by a fallen beam. Socialist historian Gaetano Salvemini survived by hiding under an architrave of a window but lost his wife, 5 children and sister. He later wrote the following:
I am a miserable wretch, without home or hearth, who has seen the happiness of 11 years destroyed in 2 minutes.
Anglican priest and football pioneer Charles Bousfield Hilliat, along with his family and other players of the Messina Football Club, perished. Composer Riccardo Castellana and his wife died alongside one another in their bed. The Hungarian soprano Paula Korolek was lying awake when the earthquake struck. She jumped from a window of the damaged Hotel Trinacria, breaking both arms in the fall. The American consulate fronting the harbor was brought down to a pile of rubble by the force of the waves created by the tsunami. American consul Arthur Cheney and his wife Laura were killed. The earthquake wrecked the commercial section along Messina's Corso Vittorio Emanuele that skirted the seafront, which included the elegant Palizzata. This was a long sequence of grand buildings that fronted the sickle-shaped harbor. The Palizzata had originally been built in Baroque style in the 17th century, and was mainly the work of Simone Gully. Most of the Baroque buildings had been destroyed in the earthquake of 1783, and were rebuilt in neoclassical style in the early 19th century. It was the imposing neoclassical palizzata, with some of the surviving Baroque buildings, that was almost entirely destroyed. Damage was heaviest in the old historic center and the sea-level central and northern sections of the city due to the soft sandy soil. The 17th century real citadella, which guarded the harbor, was partially destroyed. It was less severe in the mountainous western part as the structures were built on firmer terrain, such as Gonzaga Fort, which was untouched and still stands to this day. Buildings in Messina had not been constructed for earthquake resistance, having been built out of small stones and carelessly applied mortar with heavy tiled roofs, ornamental cornices, unsupported cross beams and vulnerable foundations on soft soil. Many had either 4 or 5 stories. In addition to the poorly constructed buildings, the widespread destruction in Messina and Reggio Calabria was due to the telluric movement having been so close to the surface. The earthquake damaged 2 of the 7 telephone cables that connected Italy and Sicily along the Strait of Messina. News of the disaster was carried to Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti by Italian torpedo boats that set out from Messina to Nicotera, where the telegraph lines were still working, but that was not accomplished until midnight at the end of the day. Rail lines in the area had been destroyed, often along with the railway stations. The Italian Navy and Army arrived and began searching, treating the injured, providing food and water, and evacuating refugees. Giolitti imposed martial law under the direction of General Francesco Mazza, with all looters to be shot, which extended to survivors foraging for food and searching through the rubble for trapped family members. The chronicles of the time report that Mazza gave his orders from a military ship docked at the port without ever going ashore, and that he ordered the immediate recovery of gold, money and valuables from the ruins of the city banks at the expense of rescuing the wounded under the rubble. He also proposed the cannonade of what remained of the Sicilian city when people were still found alive under the rubble. Many Italian soldiers under his orders were guilty of countless abuses and crimes against the earthquake population, such as the cruel shooting of a 15-year-old boy who was searching for his parents in the rubble, reported in detail by the Messina Senator Giovanni Alfredo Cesario, followed by dozens of other unofficial executions of Messina citizens, mistaken for jackals but who were actually searching through the rubble of their homes in order to be able to scrape together something to feed themselves or shelter from the weather. King Victor Emmanuel III and Queen Elena arrived 2 days after the earthquake to assist the victims and survivors. Queen Elena arranged for the wounded to be transported to a hospital ship and personally assisted in their care as a nurse, as well as organizing a fundraiser for the victims in Rome. When Pope Pius X heard the news of what happened in Messina, he filled the Apostolic Palace with refugees. Most of them were children who remained orphaned and had no other family relatives left. The disaster made headlines around the world and sparked an international response, with countries and organizations coming together to provide aid and support for the victims. With the help of the Red Cross and sailors from the Russian and British fleets, provisions and aid were delivered as quickly as possible. The Russian battleships Cesarevich and Slava and the cruisers Bogatyr and Admiral Makarov, along with British battleship Exmouth and the cruisers Euryalus, Minerva, and Sutlej were ordered to head to Messina and provide assistance and transport the wounded to the nearest cities of Italy for treatments. The French battleships Justice and Verite, and 3 torpedo boat destroyers, were sent to Messina. 2 battleships of the U.S. Navy's Great White Fleet, USS Connecticut and USS Illinois, along with supply ships USS Celtic and USS Kulgoa, arrived in Messina. The American supply vessels, including the tender USS Yankton, filled with extra medical personnel and supplies from the battleship fleet, remained anchored, giving medical aid. Other nations' ships also answered the call for help, saving many lives. When the ships arrived in Messina, the sailors saw the huge destruction the earthquake caused. All the houses and port facilities were destroyed. The surviving residents, mad with grief, pain, and the loss of loved ones, asked for help. From the rubble came the cries of the wounded, and numerous fires were still burning deep inside the city. The Russian sailors, who were the first to arrive, began clearing the debris. The fact that the aftershocks still occurred and that structures were still collapsing threatened the lives of sailors who were dismantling the remains of buildings in search of survivors. A total of 293 aftershocks took place between December 28, 1908 and March 11, 1909. Medical assistance was provided by Russian doctors to the wounded and the sick children and elders. This assistance saved the lives of many people who wouldn't have survived without it. Subsequently, the crews of the newly arrived English squadron joined the Russian rescuers. Rescue teams worked around the clock and managed to save more than 2,000 people from the rubble. The rescue operation involved more than 6,000 sailors and 300 doctors. Only on January 3, the local authorities, thanking the Russian Navy, notified them that they were now able to manage on their own. Messina did not forget her saviors. 2 years later, the King of Italy awarded a commemorative medal for 1908 earthquake assistance. Also, the sculpture of Russian sailors saving people from the debris of buildings was installed with the money raised by the inhabitants of the city. Several streets in Messina have been named after the Russian sailors, including Largo dei Marinai Russi, Square of Russian Sailors. In the wake of the earthquake, many of the homeless residents of Messina and Calabria were relocated to various parts of Sicily and other regions of mainland Italy. Others, including the majority of the survivors from the poverty-stricken Avignon quarter of Messina, resorted to emigration to the United States. At 5:40 a.m. on the morning of January 23, 1909, a cargo ship named the Florida carried 850 such passengers away from Naples. The Florida would transport the survivors to a new life in New York City. After 2 weeks on the Atlantic, the Florida's passengers endured a second disaster. Lost in dense fog, the Florida collided with the Republic, a luxury passenger liner. 3 people aboard the Florida were killed instantly. Within minutes, chaos broke out on the ship. The captain of the Florida, Angelo Ruspini, used extreme measures to regain control of the desperate passengers, including firing gunshots into the air. Luckily, the RMS Republic was the flagship of the White Star Line's Boston service, and being one of the 10 largest passenger liners in the world at the time, was fitted with a new Marconi radio, so it could send out a Morse code call for help. This was to be the first recorded distress call using the Marconi radio and resulted in 1,500 people being saved, many of whom were rich American millionaires. Miraculously, the SS Florida managed to make it to New York despite extensive damage. Her passengers were transferred to the White Star Ocean liner RMS Baltic, which answered the Republic's distress call. After being rescued at sea, the damaged Florida and the Messina earthquake survivors arrived in New York's harbor. Shaken and unnerved, the immigrants overcame yet another challenge and were ready to start a new life. Back in Messina, the disaster left the local economy in ruins, and the city faced a temporary depopulation after so many died and most survivors were homeless who had sought refuge elsewhere, in particular in Catania and Palermo, where a large number found work as artisans. It has been estimated that only 19,000 remained, with just 2,000 in the old city center. However, there was soon a huge influx of migrants, mostly from nearby Sicilian and Calabrian localities, who were needed as necessary laborers for the reconstruction. When the reconstruction of Messina began in 1909, authorities mandated architecture able to withstand earthquakes of variable magnitude in order to avoid a future disaster. Initially, though, there was a plan to demolish the remaining structures of Messina and relocate the city and its port elsewhere in Sicily. This suggestion was discarded after a wave of strong protests from the few Messineses left. The new city of Messina was constructed on the rubble of the old city, using the plan of a modern layout with buildings of uniform size and height as presented in 1911 by architect Luigi Borzi. This necessitated the demolition of buildings that were salvageable but did not conform to the new urban plan. These included the Palazzata, the Baroque San Gregorio church situated above Via Monastery, and the 18th century Chiesa dell'Anima del Purgatorio, which was badly damaged but was still salvageable. A few structures survived the earthquake untouched, such as the San Ranieri Lighthouse, the 18th century Palazzo Calipaggi di Alcantars, Giovanni Montorsi's Fountain of Neptune, and the statue of Messina. Others, such as the Vittorio Emanuele Theatre, the Messina Cathedral, also known as Duomo di Messina, and Monte di Pieta, sustained considerable damage but remained standing. Today, Messina, a city more ancient than Rome, stands as a testament to the triumph of human perseverance over adversity. But because of its scarcity of historical buildings as a result of the catastrophic 1908 earthquake, as well as the 1943 Allied bombardment during World War II, Messina has been often called the city without memory. In 2008, 100 years after the tragic event, it was proposed that the concurrent tsunami was not generated by the earthquake but rather by a large undersea landslide it triggered. The probable source of the tsunami was off Giardini Naxos, 40 kilometers south of Messina on the Sicilian coast, where a large underwater landslide body with a head wall scarp was visible on a bathymetric map of the Ionian seafloor. The Messina Strait is only 3 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and there are plans to build a bridge over it. If this construction project goes ahead, the bridge will be built directly across the Messina-Taormina Fault. Therefore, if a future earthquake happens on this fault, it could damage the bridge and the connection of Sicily to the mainland. It is possible to build a bridge that can take account of tectonic movements from earthquakes. For example, the Ryan-Antirian Bridge crosses the Gulf of Corinth in Greece, which is getting wider at a rate of 16 millimeters per year, due to tectonic extension. In light of that, the Italian government chaired by Giorgia Meloni approved a decree law on March 16, 2023 to proceed with the construction of the Messina Bridge. It is therefore expected that the work will start in 2024. If the project is finalized, the Messina Bridge would be the world's longest suspension bridge and will cost no more than 12 billion euros. Now, at the end of this video, we have to ask ourselves one question: can a disaster of that scale ever happen again? It's fair to say that the catastrophe of 1908 possessed all the necessary ingredients for a disaster. Aside from the devastating earthquake that caused the majority of victims, the ensuing tsunami took the lives of the few survivors who escaped. Adding to that, the fires that ravaged the city and the torrential rain made it a recipe for a complete disaster. If an earthquake would strike this region again, which is very likely, given the seismic activity of Messina and Reggio de Calabria and the time span between their past major earthquakes, the 1783, the 1908, and now, roughly 100 years later, we can expect something similar to happen anytime soon. Thank you so much for watching Complete Disasters. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the channel by giving a like, leaving a comment, and last but not least, subscribing to stay up to date with the latest releases. Farewell for now, and thank you once again for watching.